Syria, our subject for tonight, is one of the most remarkable stories in world affairs in years. The Syrians, as you will remember from 2011, staged a popular revolution. It was part of the Arab Spring. Six countries altogether took part in the Arab Spring, and Syria was really the last of them in March of 2011. For 14 years, the ruling government, the Bashar al-Assad, staged a war against its own people. And then last December, rebel forces threw out the dictator and his dynasty. And if you can believe it, they were in power for half a century plus, one family rule. So now, and to tell you about how remarkable this event is, it is conceivable that Syria could become the first real democracy in the Arab world. But a lot of people in Syria and outside have doubts. They center in part on the new leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, and especially on his pedigree. For he led al-Qaeda, the jihadist militia, in the internal war against Bashar al-Assad. He was obviously not the only leader, and he was not the only jihadist leader. He wasn't part of ISIS, I should make it really clear, but he was the leader of the al-Qaeda branch known as the Nusra Front. So the question tonight is, now what? Where is Syria heading? I can't think of anyone who is so well informed on Syria as our speaker. Robert Ford served as the U.S. ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014, at the time of the national uprising. I knew him. I was a reporter actually covering the war in Syria, and I knew him as one of those rare diplomats who really had his ear to the ground. He listened to the voice of Syrians. And that got him in deep trouble with the Assad regime, which staged demonstrations against him and threatened his safety. He had to close the embassy in February 2012, barely a year after he got there. But he kept up his ties with the Syrian opposition ever since. And when the regime fell last December, he was well plugged in. He's a career diplomat, one of that group of esteemed individuals in public service who care about the world and the American role in the world. He served previously as ambassador to Algeria, deputy ambassador to Iraq. These were tough assignments, let me tell you. And he held high diplomatic posts in Turkey, Egypt, and Bahrain.
I have 1, 2, 3 big messages. The first is going to be what to do about this guy, who's the new president of Syria. Second, I want to talk about the biggest challenges in Syria, including Israel. And third, I want to talk about what should we, the Americans, be doing? What's my recommendation? So all of that in 30 minutes, and then I look forward to some questions. So first, this guy, as Roy said, was in al-Qaeda in Iraq. I was in Iraq between 2000. I started there in 2003 and served until 2010 with 20 months off for good behavior when they made me ambassador to Algeria, but then Condi Rice sent me back to Iraq again. So during that time, this guy, who's now the president of Syria, that's him on the left in his al-Qaeda guise. And he was a senior al-Qaeda commander up in northern Iraq in a city called Mosul. For Americans who were in Iraq, you might remember Mosul was one of the worst, nastiest places. The State Department actually lost 5 diplomatic personnel in 2 different car bombs up in Mosul during that time, and hundreds of American soldiers were killed or injured up in that Mosul area by this guy and his fighters. So starting in 2023, a British non-government organization which specializes in conflict resolution invited me to help them bring this guy out of the terrorist world and into regular politics And at first, I have to tell you, I was very leery of going. I sort of had images of me in an orange jumpsuit with a knife to my throat. But after talking to several people who had gone in, and one of whom had met him, I decided to take the chance. And so the first time I met him, this guy's name is nom de guerre, was Abdulkader Jolani, but his actual name is Ahmed Shara, which he only revealed to the world after he captured Damascus in the Blitzkrieg of December 2024, about 5 months ago. First time I met him, I sat down next to him, and I'm literally as close as I am to Roy, and I said, this is all in Arabic, I said, never in a million years could I imagine that I would be sitting next to you. Long beard, in fatigues. And he looked at me, he speaks very softly, and he said, Walla ana, me neither. And we went on and actually had a pretty civil conversation. I share this because he said something which really piqued my interest. He never apologized for the terrorist attacks in Iraq or in Syria, although there were many fewer in Syria. Never apologized. But he also said, you know, now I am governing an opposition-held area of northwest Syria, and I am learning that the tactics and the principles that I was following in Iraq do not apply when you actually have to govern 4 million people. And they had 2 million residents of that area of Syria, and then another 2 million refugees who had come there from other parts of Syria. So they had a population of 4 million. He said, I am learning that to govern, you have to make compromises. I was very struck by that. So that was in March 2023, just over 2 years ago. We went back a second time in September. And, oh, I forgot to mention, both times I went, we also met the Syrian Christian communities up in those areas. Many had fled, most had fled, but there were still some Christians there. We asked them, how's life? How, you know, this guy's a jihadi, how is it? And they said, the guy who is now the bishop of Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, at the time was not the bishop, but he was kind of their spokesman. He said, you know, it was a lot worse 5 or 6 years ago. It's much better now because his people are more disciplined, and they are actually beginning to return houses that were seized from us. They are beginning to return agricultural lands that were seized from us during the worst of the fighting of the Civil War. We went back in September to see how that was going. Were they still getting their lands back? And we met the now Bishop, Hannah, and we met probably 20 other Christian people in the room. And we said, how's it going? And they said, all of our houses have been returned. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. How many houses are we talking? And they said about 50. I'm like, whoa, that's pretty good. And I said, what about the agricultural lands? And they said, all pieces have been returned except one. And I said, well, what's with the one? And they said, we don't know exactly, but there's some kind of a dispute about it. So before we left Idlib that time, I asked him, I said, what's with the one piece of land hasn't been returned? What are your staff telling you about it? And he said, I know what you're talking about. And he said, it's been seized by one of our armed groups. He was in the head of the coalition. I said, well, how come it hasn't been returned? He said, well, we're trying to convince them. I thought, trying to convince them? You're like, you know, you're the guy with the guns. Tell them. I said to him in Arabic, compel them, ijbarhum. And he said, I would rather do this politically rather than pick a fight, armed fight with this group. Why am I telling you this long story? Because now in Syria, if you're following the news, you would know that there was killings up in the Mediterranean coast in March with the minority Alawite community, and there's been fighting just outside of Damascus the last few days. Shara has sent in, this guy, has sent in forces, but he is not opening fire and attacking militias that are only loosely under his command, nor is he attacking militias that are rejecting the rule of Damascus. He's trying to bring people into rooms and talk to them. This is not the way al-Qaeda is supposed to run the world. No, I'm not kidding. Tony Blinken called me in December when the government fell. And I'm sitting up in Maine. It was a heavy snowstorm, actually. And I'm sort of wondering, like, this is surreal. I'm sitting in my living room watching snow, and Tony Blinken is calling me and asking what to do about Syria. So he said, you know, Robert, what should we do? Should we talk to him? What do you think? He knew that I had met Shara twice in 2023, because I had informed them. And he said, well, what do you think of him? And I said, well, I just don't think he's not the kind of al-Qaeda guy we think of with al-Qaeda. So here are some examples of things he's doing which lead me to think he's something different. I mean, first of all, that's his wife. How many of you ever saw a picture of Osama bin Laden's wife? How many of you ever saw a picture of the head of ISIS's wife, Ayad Baghdadi? He knew Ayad Baghdadi. He worked with him in Iraq. That's her. In this particular picture, they're in the Hajj. But she's very clearly identified by the media as Mrs. Shara, and he's introduced her to the media. This is not done in Salafi, hardline, Salafi, traditional jihadi circles. It is not done. Never, never. She's actually hosted meetings with civil society organizations in the media. This is not done. It's simply never done. Okay, next. I'm going to give you just a little bit of Islamist ideology. Salafi, jihadi Islam. The legitimacy of a government, Here in the United States, it comes from elections and the Constitution. If you are an al-Qaeda Salafi jihadi, the legitimacy of a government does not come from elections, because elections elect people who make laws. And they say people are fallible, and so the only infallible source for legitimacy is God and God's law, the Sharia. If you call for elections, they would say, you are an infidel. That's why there were no elections, for example, in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was never calling for elections. And al-Qaeda, this guy, rejected elections, totally rejected elections in Iraq. And I was there organizing elections with the American government. And he rejected them. It was like blowing up polling stations. And he did not apologize for it. I want to emphasize that. I told Blinken he did not apologize for these things. But about a month ago, he said, we're going to hold elections in Syria. It's not going to be right away. It's going to be in 3 or 4 years, but we will hold elections. You cannot be a Salafi jihadi and call for elections. It just doesn't work. So something is going on here that's not your normal al-Qaeda guy. He invited a group of American Jewish people to go, who had Syrian origin. I think the Syrian-American, there's a Syrian-American citizen group called Syrian Emergency Task Force that was doing humanitarian ends and such things. When the government fell, they then contacted an American Syrian Jewish group and said, how would you like to visit Damascus? They hadn't been to Damascus in like 50 years, because the previous government, the Assad family government, the Sopranos of the Middle East, they booted all the Syrians out, killing quite a few in the process. So this family said, we would love to go. And this picture is from mid-February. They had not been there in 50 years. It was a conscious decision to do that. Do you think Osama bin Laden would have had that? Ayad Baghdadi? No way, he would have murdered him. So they're talking about doing another trip and organizing money to renovate the Jewish synagogue in downtown Damascus. You can hear the surprise in my voice. Shara has been very clear he doesn't want to fight a war with the Israelis. He keeps saying we need time to rebuild. We need peace. Our country is devastated by a 12-year civil war. We must have peace. So the Israelis not only occupied the demilitarized zone, Henry Kissinger's demilitarized zone, they went even beyond it. The green areas on that map are the Israelis' incursions into Syria, occupation, not incursions, they're staying there. They've actually gone in and seized additional Syrian territory. All of this in December and January. So when Shaddai invites a Jewish group to come to Damascus, they meet the deputy foreign minister, they're treated well, they go to the synagogues, they held a service. At the same time the Israelis are doing this, do you see how he's sending a message, but the Israelis are responding with a different message? And then, as you said, the Israelis then have said, there's a minority Druze community. They're Muslims, but of a different denomination, if you will. They live over in this area. The Israelis have said, we will take it upon ourselves to protect them. Now, mind you, the Israelis never, I want to emphasize this, never used their air force to protect civilians when the Assad government was bombing them throughout Syria for 12 years. Not one time did the Israeli Defense Forces ever hit the Syrian Air Force bases or Syrian munition camps, never, in order to protect civilians. They attacked Iranian troop concentrations in Syria, but never moved to protect civilians. So this is quite a policy change. And what are the Israelis doing? They're very open about it. Their finance minister, Smotrich, the day before yesterday said, we need to keep Syria weak and divided. And so that's the Israeli policy. They want to keep it weak and divided. So this is my first bit of advice for the Trump administration. And I wrote this in a foreign affairs article about 2 months ago. The Turks are big friends of the Syrian government, of Ahmed Shaddai. There you can see the Turkish president when he met Shaddai after Shaddai captured Damascus and became the president. The Turks are talking about setting up a defense agreement with the new Syrian government and even putting Turkish fighter jets on bases inside Syria. And the point of it is, and the Turks are very open about it, to defend Syrian airspace. Now, who's violating Syrian airspace? Well, the Americans are in the east, but that's a different issue. But it's mostly the Israelis, as the event yesterday had. It is not impossible that Israel and Turkey are going to start shooting at each other in Syria. It is a genuine possibility. Zoom up 30,000 feet, even take Syria out of it. In the wake of the Gaza war and what happened in Lebanon, the weakening of Hezbollah, the weakening of Hamas, the weakening of Iran, Israeli military superiority in the region now is greater than at any time in the past. There is no country, there is no combination of countries in the Middle East that can threaten Israel's existence now. It's finished. They have complete military superiority. However, Turkey is an up-and-coming military power in the Middle East, and they won a big victory with their allies taking Damascus. And the Turks have things like drones. If you followed the Ukraine war, you know that the Ukrainians used to very good effect Turkish drones. The Turks make their own fighter aircraft. The Turks make a large variety of defense equipment, and they're selling it, and actually they're doing pretty well. And so if Henry Kissinger was looking at this, he'd say we have two military powers that have never fought each other, but that are now coming into contact in a place they never came into contact before, Syria. This is dangerous. Do you see what I'm saying? So were I Donald Trump, I think I would ask Mr. Witkoff, when he's finished with Ukraine and Iran, easy jobs, maybe to work on this, to keep the Israelis and the Syrians, the Israelis and the Turks from fighting each other over the largely prostate body of Syria, especially when the Israelis are taking very provocative actions, and the Turks are responding to those provocative actions by saying, we're going to help the Syrians. You can just kind of see where this is going. And I don't think the Israelis and the Turks, in my experience, have almost no experience talking to each other about Syria, almost none. I went to Syria in January. I met Ahmed Shara, the president then. When I saw him in the presidential palace, I said, never in a million years did I expect to see you here. And he kind of grinned and he said, well, I like to keep surprising you, Mr. Ambassador. He has a sense of humor. I don't normally think of al-Qaeda as having a sense of humor, but anyway. So on that trip, I kind of walked around Damascus a lot. We were there for about 10 days. This is the second half of January. And one of the things that happened is, in contrast to when Assad was there, the Sopranos, and people were terrified to talk to me because they didn't want to have the secret police go over and say, what was the American ambassador doing in your shop? What was the ambassador doing talking to you? What were you saying to him? And hauling them in for questioning, usually with a beating in the process. Now, people were like coming up to me as I'm walking down the street. I was really surprised. And they'd say, aren't you the American ambassador? Aren't you Robert Ford? I was shocked. And I don't mean like it happened 3 times. I mean like every time I walked around, every 5 minutes someone would come up to me. So this is a picture which someone else took and I said, please send me a copy. I was sitting in a cafe, having coffee and talking to the guy in the green sweater, who is the cafe owner. His name is Raphael. He's a Syrian Christian. And I was asking him, are you nervous about the president, and his al-Qaeda connections? And he would say, yeah, we're nervous. So far, so good, but yeah, we're nervous. These other 2 people, perfectly, they came in, they saw us talking, they sat down. They're not secret police. They heard we were talking about politics. They want to join in. The guy in the front whips out his camera because he's going to take a selfie. So this never happened during the Assad government. Never, never, never. There's a freedom of expression which is quite remarkable. And Raphael, in the center, the cafe owner, was pretty critical of Ahmed Shara, the president. And these guys are witnesses to it. And the one with the beard closest to me, he was not so critical. The one with the scarf that was getting ready to do the selfie, his name was Marcel, also a Christian. He was even more sharply critical than Raphael was. So in the old days, the secret police would have picked him up and jailed him. But they're not even worried about it now. It's really a change. I don't know, Roy, if it's going to become a democracy, but it certainly has freedom of speech. And this is now 3 months ago, but my Syrian friends who are there, as well as journalists I'm talking about, just exchanged emails a couple of hours ago with the Dutch journalists there. Actually, it was over Signal, but I hope Peter Hesketh didn't see it. And she was saying, no, people are still, it's like it was in January. It hasn't changed. This is a map from about a month ago, I guess a little more, almost 2 months now. Who controls what in Syria? I got to leave the mic. We still have, out here, about 1,400 American soldiers. How many of you knew that? Oh, a few did. Okay, good. Here's the question. When did they go? When did they first go to Syria? Anybody know? 2000. Yeah, the Obama administration. They went in February 2015. They have now been there for more than 10 years. What is their mission? Well, Obama sent them there to fight ISIS because at the time, ISIS controlled all of this. ISIS is pretty much beaten. In 2019, they lost their last territory. Now they kind of operate in 3Zs and 4Zs and an occasional 5Z. And they do ambushes and they do an occasional car bomb. But they don't control any territory. They don't have oil wells like they used to that generated hundreds of millions of dollars. They don't have big stashes of cash all over the place. They're sort of trying to survive. You can read about this if you're interested. Just Google on the internet, Office of the Inspector General, Defense Department, Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the name of the military operation. And you can read the assessments of the American military itself, which says al-Qaeda no longer presents a threat to the United States. But we're still there. And this is now 10 years. The oil cliff is right over here and over here. And we're not talking about like Saudi Arabia oil or Venezuela oil. There's, by Middle East standards, this is small oil. Next slide. I didn't plant cliff there. So I think all of us as American citizens, when we send American troops overseas on some military mission, we need to ask these three questions. I'm not going to read them. But the last one, I think, is the most important. This Syrian Democratic Forces is a Syrian Kurdish militia, among others. It's called democratic because that's what the American military told them to call themselves. I'm not kidding. You can Google that, too, and look at it on YouTube. A general admitted it. Okay, so let's look at this. This is a picture of them. This is after they seized a city from ISIS. This picture is from 2017, so this is 8 years ago. Anybody know who the guy in yellow is? His name is Öcalan. He is the head of the Kurdish Workers' Party. It's on the American government terrorism list. It's on the European Union's terrorism list. And it's on, of course, Turkey's terrorism list. And they have committed numerous terrorist attacks in Turkey, including a bombing at the Istanbul airport and a bombing at the Ministry of Interior in Ankara. That was 3 years ago. And just a year and a half ago, they did paragliders like Hamas over the border from Syria and attacked a military technology institute in southern Turkey. So here they are with the American help, because the Americans facilitated this recapture of this city, with a little parade. Understand who we are working with. We've been there 10 years, as I said. ISIS, according to the American military's own estimates, is not a threat. I don't know when this is going to end, but it is very clear that why we are there now is to protect that militia. And the militia has set up its own government in northeastern Syria. The whole area in the purple is controlled by that Kurdish Workers' Party affiliate militia in Syria with American air cover. American Air Force flies multiple missions a day over that area. The Turks are furious because they say that is a safe haven for people to come into Turkey to attack. Every time there's an attack, the Turks complain to Washington and to the U.S. military. The Turks really despise the American military for enabling this. They're so angry at the American military. And the Americans say, we'll look into that, and nothing changes. Really, I'm serious. So I think this is a question we all need to ask as Americans. Do we owe the Syrian Democratic Forces an indefinite military commitment and indefinite protection? Two things to think about. Number one, they were great allies against ISIS. I want to be very clear about that. They were brave fighters. They're very organized. They responded extremely well to working with the American military. That's why the American military loves them so much. They really helped in the war on ISIS. They took 11,000 casualties fighting ISIS. 11,000 dead, not just casualties, 11,000 dead. They sacrificed a lot. This was all controlled by ISIS. Now it's not. It's essentially controlled by that militia with the American military behind them. Do we owe them? Do we owe them? Because I hear members of Congress say that a lot. We owe them. I'm sorry, I'm a realist. We owe nothing to foreigners. We owe only to ourselves. However, there are often times when we share interests. There are often times when we share interests, and we should work with them. I don't care if it's NATO or if it's South Korea, whatever. If we share an interest, then obviously work with them. But right now, ISIS is gone. ISIS was a problem for that Kurdish militia. They were attacking Kurdish cities and Kurdish towns. They were killing Kurds. Of course they wanted American help. They were right to want American help, and we did help them. But now that's essentially finished. So do we need to stay there? Do we still share an interest, and do we have a national interest in getting in the middle of a war between Turkey, with a population of 90 million and one of the G20 biggest economies in the world, and this particular militia? Do we really want to be in the middle of that? You can read my Foreign Affairs article and you'll see what I think. The good news is that former Al-Qaeda in January said to me, you know, when we were in control of northwest Syria, when I first met you, he said that population was all Sunnis, Sunni Arab Muslims. He said, and we could kind of govern them in a certain way, and like we wouldn't let the Christians, we gave them their homes back, but we wouldn't let their churches ring church bells because that would kind of annoy the Muslims in the neighborhoods. So we told them not to do it. He said, but now we're in control of Damascus and the whole country, essentially the whole country. We can't govern that way because we have to deal with all these other groups, which we didn't have to in northwest Syria. He said to me, we will have to govern in a totally different way, corresponding to the way Syria itself is multicultural and multi-religious, multi-ethnic. I was like, wow, that is not what a Salafi jihadi would say. I actually said to him, how come you didn't say that before? Like in 2022, 2023, the war might have ended much earlier. And he said, well, it's hard to convince the soldiers who think they're fighting for something. He said, we have to convince them. I remembered the story about the piece of agricultural land in 2023. We're having to convince. So here's an example. This is the Kurdish commander. This is our guy. This is our guy, Muslim Abdi. Shara signed a deal with him a month ago, which said, we're not going to fight each other. We're going to merge eastern Syria back into the rest of Syria peacefully. We're going to merge the militias back into the Syrian army. The Kurdish militia is going to be merged. They'll be paid. We're going to merge the administrations in eastern Syria with the rest of Syria, and we're going to do it peacefully. Now, of course, the devil is in the details. But so far, so good. They've actually turned over several Kurdish neighborhoods in that second largest city of Aleppo I mentioned. And although the worst and hardest work is still well ahead of them, I have to say, so far, so good on this. Okay, next slide. So even if we owe the Syrian militia, I'm not sure we still need our troops there. Okay, last point is on sanctions. This is just a list of the kinds of sanctions we have on Syria. And they're essentially designed to cripple the Syrian economy. Some of these are really old. They go back to 1979. I was a student at Johns Hopkins in Homewood in 1979. So, and you can see, like, 79 was essentially designed, no foreign aid, no military exports. 2004, they further limited trade and investment, and they gave specific reasons. 1979, sponsor of terrorism, which they were. The Syrian government was helping Palestinian terror groups like the PFLP and the PFLP-GC. And I mean, yeah, they were a state sponsor. 2004, the Congress passed this act. This was George W. Bush, the invasion of Iraq. The Syrians are helping people like Ahmed Shara sneak into Iraq to fight the Americans. So the Congress responded, and Bush signed this law, George W. Bush, and they listed the reasons why they're increasing sanctions. Human rights abuses, occupation of Lebanon, corruption, WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Because the Sopranos, Assad government, had a big chemical weapons program, and they had they for a time were building a nuclear reactor as well with North Korean help. They were giving aid to the jihadis in Iraq, as I mentioned, and they were buying Saddam's oil, which was breaking a United Nations sanctions regime. So they listed all these justifications to further limit trade and investment. Next slide. And then there were more sanctions. When I was there, especially in Washington, we increased sanctions. We targeted Syrian officials. It was great to put Mrs. Assad on the list. We targeted the central banks so that they couldn't. They not only could they not use dollars, but they couldn't like get dollars from somebody else and buy third country stuff. That was not allowed. We essentially shut down their oil exports. And we just said, not only is we limiting trade, but now we're just banning it. So that was in 2011 because of the civil war and the atrocities the Syrian government was committing in civil war. And then in 2019, there were still more sanctions during the Trump administration, which are called secondary sanctions, where, for example, if you're a Saudi investment company and you want to invest in Syria, the US Treasury could come in and say, all of your dollar accounts around the world are frozen. That has a tendency to make the Saudi investment company say, oh, well, we're not that interested in Syria after all. So Ahmad Shara, when I met him in January, can you go back? The other way. He said, we're not sponsoring terrorism anymore. That's over. We're not doing that. And they just arrested a bunch of Palestinian militants 2 weeks ago. So he said human rights abuses, I mean, Ambassador, walk around, see what you think. Well, I told you about the freedom of speech, etc. There were protests in Damascus while I was there. The Syrian police watched, didn't shoot. People are organizing civil society groups. The government is just letting them. So occupation of Lebanon, well, that ended in 2005, so that's certainly not the case. Corruption, well, I'm sure there's corruption in Syria, but is that a reason to put sanctions on a country? I mean, there's corruption everywhere, including here in the United States. So weapons of mass destruction, Shara has invited the United Nations agency specializing in chemical weapons to come to Syria and do inspections of any site they choose, and anything they find will be turned over to the United Nations. Aid to jihadis in Iraq, well, the war is over, and he's not sending aid to jihadis anyway. And buying Saddam's oil, well, that's very old history. He said, why are you still keeping these sanctions? Like, the reason they were put there is gone. Next slide. The Civil War is over. Why are you putting sanctions on us because of the Civil War? He made a strong pitch for the sanctions to be ended. And I noticed their foreign minister was in New York over the weekend, and he said the same thing. If you Google Syrian foreign minister in New York, you'll see a statement he made where he said, we want to have good relations with the United States, but we must see these sanctions end. The destruction of the country, this is a town called Marat Noman. It had a population before the war of about 100,000. I visited it. When we visited it this time, 100,000 people. When we were there, we didn't stay long. We drove through the streets for about 10 minutes. We saw 3 people in 10 minutes in a city that had 100,000. I mean, there was not a building that wasn't damaged. There are suburbs of Damascus that are absolutely flattened. They look like Gaza. So they need access, not to American foreign aid, because he knows he's not going to get any. They just want the sanctions lifted so that other companies are not afraid to invest or give them aid. For example, the Saudis or the Kuwaitis or the Emiratis or the Qataris. Under American sanctions, those secondary sanctions I mentioned from 2019, those countries could fall under sanctions. And so they're hesitating. Everybody's looking at Washington to say, what are you doing about the sanctions? And so far, I have to tell you, the Trump administration is not doing anything. They're just kind of watching. So I think I'm going to stop there because I've talked a long time. Yeah, much longer than I should have. So
Let's go to questions.
yeah.
Major supporters for the Assad regime were Iran, Russia, and Lebanese Hezbollah.
Right.
Could you bring us up to date with those three? Where are they now? Are they trying to horn in and play a role? Or are they all shaken so badly that the Assads are gone?
Yeah.
Do they have a strategy?
So the Iranians,
Let me give you this.
so the sorry, I'm out of control, Roy. So the Iranians, first I have to say, Ahmad Shara sees it as one of his life's duties to defend Sunni Muslims against the Iranian Persian Shia. He just views that as like one of his like things, that's one of his missions in life. And so he really, I mean, he may not like the Americans very much, but he really hates the Iranians. So he essentially booted them out, closed the embassy and ejected them. The Iranians still have contacts because they were big friends, as Roy mentioned, of the Assad government, the Sopranos. And in fact, they have sent weaponry and money to some anti-government groups up on the Mediterranean coast, which was one of the reasons for that fighting up there. I am not going for an instant to justify the murder of Alawi civilians at the hands of some of the former rebel groups, Sunni rebel groups, which Shah should have had under better control. I sometimes think I wish he would use the stick more than the political carrot. But for the most part, Iranian influence is much, much, much less. And the Israelis were constantly bombing Iranian targets between 2000, I gotta get my dates right, between 2015 and 2024. And they're really not bombing any Iranian targets because there aren't any. So Hezbollah was decimated during the war in Lebanon. Their leader was killed, and many fighters were killed, and many ammunition dumps were blown up. The Israelis have a terrific intelligence service, and they have remarkably detailed information about not only the Iranians, but also Hezbollah. And so Hezbollah is very weak, too. The Russians, the Israelis are not bombing the Russians in the Middle East. However, the Russians are totally preoccupied with Ukraine and had actually brought down the number of Russian soldiers and equipment, fighter planes stationed in Syria. That's one of the reasons Shah's blitzkrieg in December, he captured the whole country in 11 days. That's why it worked so well. In fact, I asked Shah, I said, you know, you had to be surprised that you were here, that you're here. Never in a million years I think you'd be here. You must be surprised. And he said, I told you in 2023 we were going to take Damascus. I said, yeah, I heard you say it. I said, but I didn't believe it. And you have to be surprised that you're here. And he said, I always thought we'd get here. Then he kind of sheepishly grinned. But I didn't think we'd get here this fast. And I said, you know, why? And he said, well, the regime was really corrupt. Their soldiers didn't want to fight. And the Russians and the Iranians were greatly weakened.
What about Assad? Does Shah want to seek, you know, war crimes, trial, bring him back? And what is happening with him in Russia?
Yeah. So the Syrian government did make a formal request to the Russian government to return Assad, and the Russians said no. And I think the Russians, my guess is this is the calculation in Moscow. We don't particularly like Bashar al-Assad. When I was ambassador and John Kerry and I, or Hillary Clinton and I met the Russians, they never said they liked Bashar al-Assad. They just kind of said, yeah, he's dumb and brutish, but he's the best thing there is for Syria. So, I mean, it was not a rousing endorsement of their ally. So I think they kind of have him and they'd rather not, but they're thinking if they turn him back over to the Syrian government, where for sure they would hang him, then they're going to lose credibility with their allies in other parts of the world, like Libya or, for example, there aren't that many Russian allies left, to be honest. And in the Middle East, there are very few. I think they would like to build their credibility as reliable, and so I don't think they're going to turn him over. I don't think. And in the meantime, because the Americans aren't lifting the sanctions, Shah is just desperate for liquidity in the banking system. And the Russians had the contract to print Syrian money. I should have brought some. So like they've had terrible inflation. And so the Russians print money, and Shah said, could you fly the banknotes, the money notes, into Damascus, because we need cash. And so the Russians have made several big, like these great big military transports, flying in literally like crates of cash. When I was in Damascus in January, I cashed $100 at a money changer. And I'm not making this up. It was a stack of bills about that thick. It wouldn't fit easily in my pocket. It had this huge bulge. It looked like I had a pistol. So the Russians are looking for angles to get in good with the new Syrian government, even though the Russians were involved in bombing hospitals and bombing bakeries and bombing schools. And I mean, they committed war crimes during the Civil War. And I don't think Shara has any love for him, and I know his fighters don't because I got to talk to some of them while we were, moving around, and they were my bodyguards, the terrorists. And and we would talk to them like, Mohammed, how did you get started in all of this? And he said, well, the Russians bombed my family's house, and we were mad, and so we took up arms. So the Russians, Marco Rubio, in his confirmation hearing in front of the Senate, said, we need to talk to the new government because if we don't, the Russians will use it as an opening to reestablish their influence. And he was exactly right. Rubio was exactly right in his Senate Foreign Relations confirmation hearing. But they're not doing anything.
Who is the larger threat to Syria today? Is it Turkey or is it Israel?
Well, the larger threat is neither. The largest threat is all these uncontrolled militias that Shara has only nominal control over. Think about Libya. What happened in Libya in 2012? There was a long fight, bombs, etc. Finally, Gaddafi is overthrown, and for a brief time there was a single Libyan government, and then the militias, which were never brought under control, began to set up their own regional governments where they were in power. And then the civil war started up again. And it still hasn't been fully resolved. My worry about Syria, Robbie, is that it'll end up like Libya. And I know Shara is thinking about that because we talked about it a little bit. But he said, I have to move very slowly, and then just another poke at me. The sanctions make it harder because if we had jobs and we had an economy that was growing and we were rebuilding, it would be easier to take the fighters and give them jobs where they're not holding guns but they're rebuilding. He's not all wrong. So beyond that, I don't think Israel is going to run in and take Damascus because we didn't want to take Damascus in 2012. I'll be honest with you, we talked about it in the White House, and we all agreed, who wants to run Syria? We don't. And I think the Israelis must be having that conversation. So they too are talking about, a divided, weak Syria, like militias in control of different parts of the country. That's their vision. I mean, it might be good for Israel, especially after they're so traumatized by what happened, the terror attack, the murder of 1,200 Israelis, October 7th, 2023. I think they've lost a little bit of perspective. But they think a divided Syria, even though it would likely help ISIS rebuild, it would likely spurn the creation of other terror groups. It will certainly increase refugee flows again. It'll be a source of instability yet again. I don't know why that's in Israel's interest, but after October 7th, they have a different way of looking at things.
But who's the larger problem? Is it Turkey or is it Israel?
Frankly, I think it's normal for a sovereign country that's coming out of a civil war to get another country to help it rebuild. And the Turks want to do that. They know there's going to be money involved once the Americans remove the sanctions. So I don't think Turkey's going to take over Syria. It's easy for me to imagine that while the Israelis won't try to govern Damascus, the Israelis might try to help the Kurds declare independence in the east and help the Druze declare independence down here, and maybe help the Alawis up here, just to keep the country divided. Kind of a Libya model, something like that. The interesting thing is, Shara had a lot of support when they got rid of Assad. People were like, finally, the Sopranos are gone, and we can speak, and we have freedoms, personal freedoms, civil freedoms, and they had hope that maybe finally rebuilding would start. Now, if rebuilding doesn't start, people's expectations are up here, and if the reality is down here, that gap is dangerous. So far, I haven't seen any other figure emerge yet in Syria that would replace him. And his fighters, the ones we met, it was very funny. they would like say, see, I've got this new meme on my phone, and it was like Ahmed Shara profile or something like that. It was very funny. So, I mean, I think within his own group, he has a lot of standing still. They must be kind of wondering, like, why is he showing pictures of his wife? But there isn't anybody there clear to replace him. There is no Ayatollah Khomeini in the wings waiting to take over, is how I would say it. Could he be the victim of an assassination? Absolutely. That's easy to imagine. Who would replace him then? We go back to the Libya scenario.
I sometimes wonder if the U.S. I sometimes wonder if the U.S. shouldn't be more interventionist. I think about 2008, 2014 in Ukraine, Egyptian Arab Spring, when you were in Damascus. Lots of examples when if we'd stepped in and done something early on, we might not have Syria turn into a Somalia. You have a sense how I might think about that issue?
All I can say is I've spent a long, long time in Iraq, and people like me were really against the Iraq War. Most of the Arabic-speaking diplomats in the State Department were totally against the war, which is why Donald Rumsfeld tried to keep us out of it. We can't fix these countries. We cannot fix these countries. The solution to Syria is in Syria. It's not even in Turkey, and it's not in Israel. It's not in Saudi Arabia. It's in Syria. What we can do that I think is helpful is encourage people to come together and talk with each other, which in many cases, culturally, they have never done before. When Shara met Mazloum Abdi, that picture I showed of him signing the deal with the Kurdish general, there had been no conversations between the government in Damascus and the Syrian Kurdish community for 50 years. I mean, I'm not making that up. The Assad government said they're not even Syrians. They wouldn't even give them passports. So bringing people together and sort of, encouraging them to work forward, training activists in terms of how to organize, how to become financially viable, how to organize themselves. I think that's useful, but you don't want them to be dependent on the Americans forever, which happened in Iraq. I mean, they never learned the skills you need to organize, and we'd say, well, I need to be paid. And I'd say, well, maybe you need to organize a group of volunteers first. The mentality of, no, we need to pay people. And we're like, well, if you don't have money, you've got to have volunteers. We have to that's that kind of training we do. I think it's great. Yale University, where I taught for 8 years, has a program where they bring people for a semester, activists from around the world, and they let them study at Yale, and they have a lot of conversations with Americans about how does civil society operate, how do political parties operate, how do newspapers operate, media companies, social media, et cetera. Enabling people who can bring change in their own countries as opposed to doing it ourselves. You don't want someone like me, in the end, really organizing an election or a political party. I will always make a hash of it.
We can facilitate things like removing sanctions early.
Oh, yeah.
And let them have the wherewithal
Right.
to do their
Absolutely. I mean, I would use the word, Cliff, I would use the word enable.
So we have one question from the Zoom from our member, Robert Ruby. He has a message. He thanks you for the useful analysis regarding Israel and Turkey's past and current engagements and their possible future clashes. He has a question, though, about Syria's future. Since the country has zero experience with even highly imperfect democracy, is it reasonable to expect HTS or any other rebel faction to aim for and protect democratic practices?
Yeah. So, Mr. Ruby, that's a fantastic question. By the way, HTS is the name of Ahmed Shara's armed group, rebel faction. It's an Arabic acronym for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the organization to liberate Syria. So I don't think we can expect Syria to turn into a democracy next year or the year after. First of all, they don't even have political parties. They have no experience organizing political parties. They have no experience doing a party agenda, doing a party platform. They have no experience with that. They have no experience of how a party in Damascus could have party offices around the country. There was a Ba'ath party in Syria, but it was never actually in control. The military was always in control. And it was sort of a figurehead, fig leaf, not a figurehead, a fig leaf, but it had no decision-making authority, and its members knew it. So basically it was there for networking. I would compare the Ba'ath party to sort of like Skull and Bones at Yale. It was a kind of a society where they would all do each other favors. So going forward, that's why I don't think they need to rush to elections. The Americans rushed to elections in Iraq, and it turned out very badly. I do think they can relatively quickly get used to the idea of not jailing people for free speech. I do think they can get used to relatively quickly respecting the right for peaceful protest. And they were doing that in January when I was there. There were 2 demonstrations that I saw. One was civil service employees complaining that they hadn't gotten paid, very fair thing to demonstrate about. And the other was a group of civil society activists who were afraid that the government was going to clamp down on them. It hasn't yet. But they were worried about it, and so they organized a protest. And again, the police laid back. That kind of experience needs to continue. We need, when, like, there were 2 U.S. congressmen in Syria the week before last. I hope they raised that and said, you did good, keep it up. It'll help build relations with the United States. It'll help that sanctions issue sooner or later. When the president of France, when the prime minister of Spain go, I hope they encourage not elections, not political parties, not democracy. They just say, protect those basic rights that are enshrined in the United Nations Charter of Universal Human Rights, the one that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote after World War II with help from an Indian lawyer and some others. So if we could just get that baseline about civil and political liberties established over a period of 3-4 years, which we never did in Iraq and never did in Afghanistan, if we could just get that and get a level of rule of law and accountability, then I think we could have elections and maybe you could begin to build something serious. But it would take years, years.
Given the need for facilitation, conflict resolution, and collaborative problem solving, have we lost any of our soft power by the dismantling of the United Institute of Peace?
Not only have we lost some of it, we've lost almost all of it. And it's a conscious decision taken by the administration. Just doesn't want to get involved in this stuff. But it's a death blow, really, to American soft power. I mean, I have to be frank. So I have some sympathy for the Trump administration wanting to reduce our commitments abroad. I do, but this, I would have thought you would use cheap soft power instead of expensive military power. I mean, it's just the cost of soft power is so much less. I taught at Yale, and one of the slides I used to put up in front of my undergraduates was the cost to operate an F-16 per hour. Back then, it was F-16s, not F-35s. And the cost to operate an F-16, pilot, maintenance, training, all of that, building the airplane, the cost to operate per hour is $60,000. So for $60,000, you can fund a couple of students to go to a state university to learn the kinds of stuff I was talking about. And, you know, when they do a mission, it's not a, 1 hour mission, it's, a couple hours. They fly out an hour or two, and then they come back an hour or two. So the mission for one airplane usually is like $250,000. Well, that adds up real quick in a month. So do I have time for a story?
Sure.
Okay. So when I was when Condi sent me back to Iraq, I told her this story because I was annoyed that she was sending me back to Iraq, and so. Oh, sorry, Condi Rice, the Secretary of State for George W. Bush. So right before she called me back to Washington to send me to Baghdad again, I had visited, I was the American ambassador in Algeria, North Africa, and I had visited a university right up on the Algerian-Moroccan border. And I had served in Algeria during the Algerian Civil War in the mid-1990s, and it was a terrible civil war between a ruthless, nasty army and a ruthless, vicious Islamist insurgency. And approximately 150,000 Algerians died in this civil war. It's 30 years ago now. But it was really bad. And the university that I went to later, when I came back as the ambassador, had been a hotbed of Islamist insurgency. And the day of my visit, and we were going to visit distance learning programs in engineering and nursing, which we had set up with the university in Tlemcen at a total cost, I'm not making this up, of $100,000. That's in 2008. And the day of the bombing, or the day of the visit, the Israelis bombed Gaza really hard. This is in 2008. And Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, the Arabic TV networks, were full of blood and gore on TV. And I'm going to an Arab university that morning. And I said to my assistant, whatever we do, we go in real quiet. I told the bodyguards, you all are staying here. We're taking one single car with one single bodyguard. We're going to tippy-toe into the university. We're going to see these two distance learning, because I had never heard of this. I mean, at that time, me, the dumb ambassador, I just wanted to see it. And then we're going to tippy-toe back out. And she said, yes, sir. So we drive up to the university, and there's this like big reception line. And I turned to my assistant, I said, damn it, this is exactly what I didn't want. And I get out of the car, and the mayor is there, and the governor, and there's a little girl with flowers and the whole thing. And I said, oh, well, we're going to all go to the distance learning class. And he was like, oh, no, we're going to the main auditorium. I'm like, oh, no, we're not going to the main auditorium. That's the last thing I want to do. I had images of like tomatoes and rocks and protesting students. Shoes. Exactly, shoes. I turned to my assistant and I said, damn it, this is exactly what I didn't want. And she's like, I told her, I'm sorry. So we go into this big room. It would be like 4 times the size of this room, full of students, full of them. I mean, it must have been hundreds and hundreds. And I'm just waiting for the shoe to drop, and they stood up and cheered. And I'm like, literally, my jaw dropped. And remember, we're fighting in Iraq at this time. We're like killing Iraqi civilians, too. And they're cheering. And I turned to the university professor, and I said, why are they cheering? Like, what is this? And he said, well, it's because of your engineering and nursing program. I said, explain. I came to see them, but like, what is it? And he said, Mr. Ambassador, he said, we had 20 graduates from the engineering program with your university in Missouri? And I'm like, yeah. And he said, all 20 got jobs. He said, the nursing graduates, 20 of them from North Carolina, yeah. He said, they all got jobs. He said, remember, Mr. Ambassador, youth unemployment in Algeria is 70%. For people to get jobs like that is unbelievable. He said, but it's because they are able to say, we have an American education. He said, now I have a long waiting list for English students, people who study English, so they can get into these programs. He said, that's why they're cheering. I turned to Amanda and I said, this cost $100,000? She said, yes, sir. She was like terrified. I said, this is the best goddamn thing I've ever seen in the Foreign Service. So I told this story to Condi. And I said, we need another $100,000 for the principal university in eastern Algeria, near the Tunisian border, which was also a hotbed of Islamist radicalism during the Civil War. Condi Rice looked at me and said, oh, Robert, that's such a nice story, but we don't have any money for that. I said, Madam Secretary, I am asking for $100,000 is all. We are spending, I knew the number, because I'd already been in Iraq, $750 million per day in Iraq. I only want $100,000 one time. She said, oh, Robert, we just don't have the money. How do you beat Islamic radicalism? Now, the good news is, being a sneaky ambassador, I did get the money. But it's the mentality, the American mentality. We fix the threat problem by bombing. That, I have to tell you, personally, I think is a losing strategy.
I think your stories are great, and I think your insights are great, and I think your overview is great. I think that we've all learned something about Syria, and not just Syria. So, Ambassador, and I think your images of the Skull and Bones Society and the Sopranos, who are no longer in power in Syria, are memorable. Thank you indeed, and we in the Baltimore Council are really lucky to have had you tonight. Thank you.